In this lesson, we're going to look at how we can start to analyze the data that we've brought into Power Pivot now and some of the functions that we have available. So in the last lesson, we ended off by creating a relationship between our workshops and our master tables. So this allows us now to use both of these tables to be able to analyze our data. If we go back to our home menu, you'll see that our main way of analyzing data is actually through our pivot table. So we're going to activate our pivot table, click on our pivot table, and it's going to ask me where do I want to create the pivot table. So I'm going to say in a new worksheet here. So I'm going to click OK. Okay, so this opens up a new pivot table for me to work with. And over here on the left hand side of my pivot table is where my report is created. On the right hand side here is where my pivot table fields are used to create the report. So let's start off by looking at a simple report. So over here we've got our two tables of data, our workshop and a master. So in our workshop data, what maybe we want to know is if we've got our different suppliers here, how much did we spend with each of our suppliers? So we've got a total cost field here. So if I take my supplier and I drop it down into my row, it will go through my data source and it will pull out each distinct unique value of my supplier. So over here, for example, I can see that I actually have a count of 5. So I have 5 different suppliers who have provided training to me. If I use my cost and I bring it down into my values menu option, then I can see what my total sum of my cost is over here. If I select the sum of cost and I right click and I use my number format, I may want to now format this. So for example, it has 1,000 separator and it has 0 decimal places, just so that readability is a little bit better. So now I have my total sum of cost for each of my suppliers. Now one of the things that I might also want to know is how many training courses did each of these suppliers run. So over here now I've got a course name, a course code and a course name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually pull this down also. So if I pull my course name down into my values, so what it will do is it will go and do a count of the course name. Now what you can see over here is actually the number of rows for each of our suppliers. So this is actually the number of transactions that have actually happened for each of our suppliers. So in essence you could actually say this is the number of employees that have gone to each of these suppliers for training, because it's gone and it's counted each of the rows. Okay, so I could actually click on here and just change this and say number of transactions or number of employees. So number of employees trained. A bit of a long heading, but that's fine. So we've got the number of employees who have been trained by each of the suppliers. However, it didn't give me the number of courses that each one of these has run. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my course name and I'm going to drag it down again into my values. Now because the course name is actually a text value, what it can only do here if I drag it down into values is to count the number of options. However, in Power Pivot we've got a very powerful function, a new function that we don't have in normal Excel called the distinct count. So instead of counting each of the transactions like we counted here, which tells me basically how many employees have been on each of these trainings, by using a distinct count I can actually now know the number of courses. To do this I'll use my summarize values by. Now you can see here I've got my sum, my count, my average, max and min, which have been grayed out because I've got a text field here. I can't sum it or average or max or min it. However, if I go to more options, it'll open up my value field settings, and if I go down to the bottom here I have something called the distinct count. What this will do is it will go through the data source and it will now count the number of course names that appears against each of the suppliers, and it will only count it once for each of the entries that are in there. So I'm going to click OK. And you can see now the number of courses actually that each of these suppliers produce. So in total I have 7 courses that run, and as you can see communication experts run 2 of these, Excel expert run 3. So I can now say a number of courses. Okay, so we can use our pivot tables to quite easily start to get different data from the fact of our options. However, here what we've done is we've only used one table of data. So we've just used our workshop, and we've just used within our workshop data we've now used our supplier, cost and a course name, which was great. All of this data was within one table. However, the majority of the time you may want to have data that is not within one table. So let's say for example if I keep my sum of cost, and let's actually just click on this. We're going to go to analyze on our pivot table tools. I'm going to say clear. I'm going to clear our pivot table. So let's say we wanted to know by employee now how much was our total cost. So if I pull down my employee ID and I pull down my cost, it will now tell me the cost that I've accumulated on each of my employee IDs. Now, employee ID is not ideal because I actually don't know who this employee is. So I've got my 50 employees there. It shows me each of the costs that are associated with the employee IDs. So what would be much better would be to actually use the master file and get my employee name. So let's take out the employee ID over here. We're going to keep our total sum of cost, and we're going to drag down our employee name. And now, because we've created a relationship between the two tables, the system can go and look up the employee name, and it can tell me the sum of cost. Another one I might want to know is how many courses did the employee go on. So if I use my employee name over here, I'm going to keep that. So I'm going to go back to my workshop over here. I'm going to do the same as what we did in the last analysis. So I'm going to take my course name and I'm going to drop it into my values, and that will count. And it will show me how many courses each of my employees has been on. Okay, so as you can see, it's very easy to be able to analyze our data using two sets of files, and this really gives us a lot of options in terms of how we can do this. Now let's say, for instance, I wanted to know the employees, the sum of cost, the sum of the training cost and the number of courses they've gone on to, but I only want to see this by specific departments. Now one of the ways I could do this is go to my master file, which I do have my departments over here, and I can drag this and drop it into my rows, and now we'll break this down into each of my different departments. So if I go down here, you can see now I have all my employees and I have my department in my row here, and it'll show me. If I go to my pivot table tools under analyze, I have a collapse and expand function. So if I go to my department here and I collapse this, it will show me now for each of my departments how much is my total sum of cost and how many courses have actually been run. In this case, it's the number of employees from each of them that have attended training. Now remember, some employees may have attended more than one training course, so that's why our total of 152 does not equal the 50 employees that we've got. So this is just counting the number of employees who have attended training. Okay, so that's one way I can collapse and expand. If I want to say human resources, for example, then I can do that. The other option that we've got is something called the slicer. So in our pivot tables tools under analyze, we've got the insert slicer function. This is a really nice function to be able to filter our table as well. So if I remove departments out of our row, we'll go back to a list of all our employees that are in our pivot table. So if we go insert slicer, and you'll see now it shows me both of my tables that are available. So let's say, for instance, I want to see our department as a slicer. So I'm going to click OK. Okay, so Excel's now created a slicer. So this is what a slicer looks like. You'll see that it gets its own slicer tools. Underneath here we also get the ability to change color if you want to go and experiment with different colors, for example. Over here we have a number of columns. So if I want to condense this a little bit, maybe into 2 columns, you'll see that it gives us quite a nice ability to change the shape of our slicer. Now you see when I click on this that it will automatically now just show me the people who are in finance, or the people in logistics, or the people in sales. So slicers are really nice tools to be able to filter and sort your data. Okay, so using a slicer, as you can see, we can easily be able to look at our different options here in terms of seeing our data. Okay, so this has been a quick look at using a pivot table to start analyzing our data from Power Pivot. This concludes this course.